evening. Leading the news this Tuesday, Senate hearings began on the Supreme Court nomination of Clarence Thomas. Soviet President Gorbachev called for a worldwide demilitarization, and for the first time in 9 years, the U.S. had a trade surplus 2 quarters in a row. We'll have the details in our news summary in a moment. Robin?
After the news summary, our lead story is the opening day of Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearings. We have excerpts and analysis. And continuing our conversations on why communism failed, we talk to socialist editor James Weinstein.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. Every day we enjoy people being cold to us, cutting us up, getting fresh with us, tearing into us, and calling us chicken. In fact, the more people do it, the happier we are. PepsiCo. And by AT&T. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
The Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas opened today. The 43-year-old judge arrived to a packed hearing room this morning. Later, he refused to answer specific questions about abortion, but told the Senate Judiciary Committee he recognized a constitutional right to privacy. The hearings are expected to last several days. We'll have excerpts and analysis of the opening session right after this news summary. Robin?
Mikhail Gorbachev today opened a human rights conference in Moscow with a call for the world to press ahead with demilitarization. He said military power drains the economy, the ecology, and the human condition. His remarks came in a speech to the 38-nation Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was the first major human rights conference ever hosted by the Soviet Union. We have more in this report narrated by Louise Bates of Worldwide Television News.
For Mikhail Gorbachev, Tuesday's conference was the chance to show the era of change which enabled him to survive last month's coup. It was a feat which won him a standing ovation. Then, with every eye upon him, Gorbachev launched his plea for economic help. He chided the West for not providing more concrete aid before last month's coup. He said positive change could only be achieved with economic assistance and urged Western leaders to pay greater attention to requests for practical support. But the CSCE conference was primarily about the issue of human rights, and it was Gorbachev's promise to end the persecution of dissidents in the Soviet Union which won him approval from Elena Bonner, the widow of a Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov. Bonner appealed to the conference to send human rights monitors to the newly independent republics, which continue to hold political prisoners. The late arrival to the conference is Secretary of State James Baker, whose 6-day mission will take him to the outer reaches of the former Soviet Empire, including the newly recognized Baltic states. Time has also been set aside to meet the Russian President Boris Yeltsin and other officials.
Secretary Baker today signaled a possible easing of the U.S. position on aid to the Soviet Union. He told reporters a Soviet commitment to economic reforms, not actual implementation of them, would be enough. He said they don't have to take the steps first, but commit to taking the steps. Tensions were running high today in the Soviet Republic of Georgia. Thousands of people demonstrated in the capital, Tbilisi, against the rule of President Zviad Gamaskordia. They erected barricades around the opposition party headquarters. The protesters have accused President Gamaskordia of human rights abuses and oppression of the republic's Muslim minority. Gamaskordia today said he was creating a defense ministry under his personal control, and he said the republic's National Guard would now answer to him rather than the Interior Ministry.
Battles raged today between Serbs and Croats in Yugoslavia. At least 15 people were killed. Some of the heaviest fighting was in the Croatian stronghold of Osijek. Serbian guerrillas shelled it in a pre-dawn raid. Croatian militia defended the town with mortars. European community truce observers confronted the Croatians and demanded they stop fighting.
Violence continued in South Africa's black townships for a third day today. Police said 14 people were killed in overnight attacks, and this morning gunmen opened fire at a Soweto train station, killing 3 women. Police said the 3-day death toll had reached 92. Most of the fighting has pitted supporters of the African National Congress against the rival Inkatha Freedom Party. Leaders of both groups have said they will sign a peace accord this weekend, despite the fighting.
Philippine President Corazon Aquino led a march and rally in support of keeping the U.S. naval base at Subic Bay. Yesterday, a Philippine Senate committee rejected allowing U.S. forces to stay 10 more years in exchange for $203 million a year in U.S. aid. Aquino wants the issue put to a citizen vote. The current lease for the naval base expires Monday.
In economic news today, the Commerce Department reported a $3 billion trade surplus in the second quarter. That followed a first quarter surplus of $10.5 billion, marking the first back-to-back trade surpluses since 1982. However, the figures included large payments to the U.S. Treasury from Japan and Saudi Arabia to help defray the costs of the Gulf War. Without those payments, the country would have actually had a trade deficit in both quarters. Also today, the FDIC reported the nation's commercial banks earned $4.6 billion in the second quarter. That was down 12% from a year ago. FDIC Chairman William Seidman said the banking industry was, quote, bumping along the bottom of the recession. He added, it doesn't look like it's getting much worse, but it doesn't look like it's getting much better.
More than 24 pilot whales beached themselves today in the Massachusetts marshes of Cape Cod. At least 4 of the whales died near the town of Wellfleet. Rescue workers splashed water over the others in an effort to keep them alive. At high tide this afternoon, the survivors were towed out to sea. A spokeswoman for the New England Aquarium said some of the whales were later seen swimming, but appeared disoriented. Whales are known to periodically beach themselves. Scientists do not know why.
Accused serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer pleaded innocent by reason of insanity to 15 murder charges today. Dahmer entered the plea before a Milwaukee County judge. Police said he admitted to killing and dismembering 17 people since 1978. His trial is scheduled to begin January 27th. That's our summary of the news. Now it's on to the Clarence Thomas hearings and a socialist view of why communism failed.
The Clarence Thomas hearings are our lead story tonight. 10 weeks after President Bush nominated Thomas to be a justice of the Supreme Court, the main confirmation event finally got underway before the Senate Judiciary Committee this morning. We have extended excerpts from what happened. Roger Mudd reports.
Even though Clarence Thomas has been practicing for these hearings for 10 weeks, he could not have been prepared for the mob of still photographers, TV cameras, reporters, police, and senators which engulfed him this morning. But he steadily made his way into the ornate Senate caucus room with his wife, Virginia, a Kansas Republican, Jamal, his son by his first marriage, his mother, Leola Williams, and his sister, Emma Mae Martin. Then, almost on time, Committee Chairman Joseph Biden opened confirmation hearings for the nation's 106th nominee to the Supreme Court.
Good morning, Judge. Welcome, welcome to the blinding lights. It's a pleasure to have you here. And let me begin also by indicating that the morning's going to be painless, Judge, or maybe the most painful part of the whole process.
The morning session was given over not to Judge Thomas, but to the senators who read their prepared statements for the cameras. Only once this morning was the nominee asked a question, and he scored quickly.
I never thought I'd be sitting here talking about the youth of a nominee to the Supreme Court. But I am. Heck, you're 6-7 years younger than I'm 48. How old are you, Judge? 42, 3?
Well, I've aged over the last 10 weeks, but 43.
43 years old.
The answer seemed to put the committee at ease, including Chairman Biden.
Some people say that the Supreme Court is already conservative. And they ask what difference it makes to have an additional conservative on the bench. Well, I think that's the wrong question. I reject that argument. First of all, I do not deny the president the right to appoint a conservative. Matter of fact, I would be dumbfounded if he didn't. And so I fully expect the Supreme Court to be a more conservative body after Justice Marshall's successor is confirmed than before Justice Marshall retired. But such an additional move to the right, which I expect, pales in comparison to the radical change in direction some are urging on the court under the banner of natural law. Pales in comparison to some of the changes that some of the people who are your strongest supporters have been urging on the philosophic thought and the notion of constitutional interpretation for the past decade.
The first and last time there was a black nominee to the Supreme Court was 25 years ago when the great NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall came before the Judiciary Committee. Back then, the committee was run by the Southerners, Eastland, McClellan, Irvin, and Thurman. But how times have changed. This year, the NAACP is fighting the Thomas nomination, and J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina is leading the fight for it.
I believe Judge Thomas is well qualified to serve as a justice of our nation's highest court. He possesses the integrity, intellect, professional competence, and judicial temperament to make an outstanding justice. In addition to his personal struggle to overcome difficult circumstances early in his life is admirable. A review of his background shows he is a man of immense courage who has prevailed over many obstacles to attain remarkable success.
Other Republicans on the committee, of course, outdid themselves praising Thomas. Orrin Hatch of Utah.
I just wish to mention my own delight at Judge Thomas's success. That success says a great deal about our country and about Judge Thomas, the man. Having grown up in the era of Jim Crow and gone barefoot in the unpaved street of his community, he will soon be able to put his feet under the bench in the highest court in this land as he contemplates the finer points of the law. I understand this. I was born into a family where we didn't have indoor facilities either during the early years of my life. And I understand what it's like in this great country. And I have to tell you, Judge Thomas, I'm so doggone proud of you, I can hardly stand it. I think it's a terrific thing that you're nominated to this position, and I personally will support you with every fiber of my being.
Other Republicans, like Simpson of Wyoming, still have stuck in their craw the 1987 defeat of Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork.
I think Judge Bork might well choose to undergo a medieval torture chamber rather than to be presented again before this committee. And that was a very unfortunate situation in my mind, whether you liked him or whether you didn't.
But the tone of the Democratic statements, though not as aggressive as they were during Bork, left no doubt that Thomas will not have a free ride.
Judge Thomas has strongly commended an article entitled The Declaration of Independence and the Right to Life. One leads unmistakably from the other. According to the article, which Judge Thomas has called splendid, abortion is the constitutional equivalent of murder. If this view is accepted by the Supreme Court, not only Roe v. Wade will be overruled, neither Congress nor any state legislature will have the power to protect a woman's right to choose an abortion even in cases of rape or incest. And federal and state governments will have an engraved invitation to invade other basic aspects of individuals' private lives.
And I'm troubled by your open admiration for those willing to deceive and defy Congress, and by the hostility you've demonstrated toward Congress, both in action and in words in your speeches. You've attacked Chief Justice Rehnquist's opinion that upheld the special prosecutor law for Watergate-style investigations. You have questioned Congress' power to enact civil rights legislation. You have repeatedly suggested that Congress has no business carrying out its oversight function, one of the most important functions of this body. Now, I've always considered the separation of powers to be the surest guarantor of the limited government you claim to prefer. So when you state a clear preference for executive branch power over congressional authority, that gives me some pause.
After a lunch break and after the senators from Thomas's home state, Thomas's adopted state, and Thomas's current state had swelled with pride, it was finally Thomas's turn.
My grandparents always said there would be more opportunities for us. I can still hear my grandfather. Y'all gonna have more of a chance than me. And he was right. He felt that if others sacrificed and created opportunities for us, we had an obligation to work hard, to be decent citizens, to be fair and good people. And he was right. You see, Mr. Chairman, my grandparents grew up and lived their lives in an era of blatant segregation and overt discrimination. Their sense of fairness was molded in a crucible of unfairness. I watched as my grandfather was called boy. I watched as my grandmother suffered the indignity of being denied the use of a bathroom. But through it all, they remained fair, decent, good people. Fair in spite of the terrible contradictions in our country. They were hard-working, productive people who always gave back to others. They gave produce from the farm, fuel oil from the fuel oil truck. They bought groceries for those who were without. And they never lost sight of the promise of a better tomorrow. I follow in their footsteps, and I have always tried to give back. Over the years, I have grown and matured. I've learned to listen carefully to other points of views and to others, to think through problems, recognizing that there are no easy answers to difficult problems, to think deeply about those who will be affected by the decisions that I make and the decisions made by others. But I've always carried in my heart the world, the life, the people, the values of my youth, the values of my grandparents and my neighbors, the values of people who believed so very deeply in this country in spite of all the contradictions. It is my hope that when these hearings are completed, that this committee will conclude that I am an honest, decent, fair person. I believe that the obligations and responsibilities of a judge, in essence, involve just such basic values. A judge must be fair and impartial. A judge must not bring to his job, to the court, the baggage of preconceived notions, of ideology, and certainly not an agenda. And the judge must get the decision right. Because when all is said and done, the little guy, the average person, the people of Pinpoint, the real people of America will be affected not only by what we as judges do, but by the way we do our jobs. If confirmed by the Senate, I pledge that I will preserve and protect our Constitution and carry with me the values of my heritage: fairness, integrity, open-mindedness, honesty, and hard work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very, very much for a moving statement.
Chairman Biden then wasted no time. What does Judge Thomas find attractive about the philosophy of natural law, that individuals and even corporations have rights over and above those in written law?
I don't see a role for the use of natural law in constitutional adjudication. My interest in exploring natural law and natural rights was purely in the context of political theory. I was interested in that. There were debates that I had with individuals, and I pursued that on a part-time basis. I was an agency chairman.
Judge, in preparing for these hearings, some suggested that might be your answer.
Yeah.
So I went back through some of your writings and speeches to see if I misread them. And quite frankly, I find it hard to square your speeches, which I'll discuss with you in a minute, what you're telling me today. I find it hard to understand how you can say that what you're now saying, that natural law was only, you're only talking about the philosophy in a general philosophic sense and not how it informed or impacted upon constitutional interpretation.
Well, let me attempt to clarify. That, in fact, though, was my approach. I was interested in the political theory standpoint. I was not interested in constitutional adjudication. I was not, at the time, adjudicating cases. But with respect to the background, I think that we can both agree that the founders of our country, or at least some of the drafters of our Constitution and our Declaration, believed in natural rights. And my point was simply that in understanding overall our constitutional government, that it was important that we understood how they believed or what they believed in natural law or natural rights. Now, my purpose was this, in looking at this entire area. The question for me was, from a political theory standpoint, you and I are sitting here in Washington, D.C. with Abraham Lincoln or with Frederick Douglass. And from a theory, how do we get out of slavery? There is no constitutional amendment. There's no provision in the Constitution. But by what theory? And repeatedly, Lincoln referred to the notion that all men are created equal. And that was my attraction to, or beginning of my attraction to this approach. But I did not, and would maintain that I did not feel that natural rights or natural law has a basis or has a use in constitutional adjudication.
At first, Thomas was not sure-footed. Biden seemed skeptical. Then came the question everybody wants an answer to. Is there a right of privacy in the Constitution, currently known as a woman's right to choose?
Now, Judge, in your view, does the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment protect the right of women to decide for themselves in certain instances whether or not to terminate pregnancy?
Senator, first of all, let me look at that in the context other than with natural law principles.
Let's forget about natural law for a minute, if you'd like to.
My view is that there is a right to privacy in the 14th Amendment.
Well, Judge, does that right to privacy in the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment protect the right of a woman to decide for herself in certain instances whether or not to terminate a pregnancy?
Senator, I think that the Supreme Court has made clear that the issue of marital privacy is protected, that the state cannot infringe on that without a compelling interest. And the Supreme Court, of course, in the case of Roe v. Wade, has found an interest in the woman's right to, or as a fundamental interest, the woman's right to terminate a pregnancy. I do not think that at this time that I could maintain my impartiality as a member of the judiciary and comment on that specific case.
I'd like to come back to just an area that was raised by Chairman Biden in the concluding part of his questions, and that was with regard to the Lehrman essay. And you, in the speech in '87, you called why black Americans should look to conservative policies. You spoke about natural law. You said, and I quote, Heritage Foundation trusted Lehrman's recent essay in American Spectator on the Declaration of Independence and the meaning of the right to life is a splendid example of applying natural law. And the title of the Lehrman article you endorsed is The Declaration of Independence and the Right to Life. One leads unmistakably from the other. The article makes only one argument, and it's about only one subject, that natural law protects the right to life, and that as a result, the Constitution must be interpreted to protect the right to life. So Lehrman's basic position in that is that abortion violates the constitutional right to life. And he argues that when the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, it simply conjured up a right of abortion. And he calls it a spurious right born exclusively of judicial supremacy with not a single trace of lawful authority. He also draws a parallel between those who support abortion and those who supported slavery. He says the decision to protect a woman's right to abortion has resulted in a Holocaust. These extreme statements, perhaps about, in terms of whatever, about a woman's right to choose, were all expressed in that article, and you call that article splendid. Is that correct?
Senator, again, I did not endorse the article, but I'd like to make this point, and it's very important, and it's perhaps one that was missed earlier. My interest toward the end of the Reagan administration was an important interest to me, and that was that I had spent almost a decade of my life battling with individuals who were conservative. And I felt that they should not be antagonistic to civil rights. And I felt that, in fact, they should be very aggressive on civil rights. In exploring on a part-time basis and during my busy work day, a unifying theme on civil rights and on the issue of race, I was looking for a way to unify and find a way to talk about slavery and civil rights, the way that the abolitionists used. The very same approach that was used and offered in the Brown v. Board of Education brief, authored among others by my predecessor, by Justice R. Marshall, whose seat I've nominated to fill. My point was that I figured, or that I concluded, that conservatives would be skeptical about the notion of natural law, but one of their own had endorsed it. And I simply wanted to give some authenticity to my approach so that I could then move on and get them to consider being more aggressive on the issue of civil rights. That was very, very important to me.
Well, have you ever publicly stated that you disagree with the article?
I have never been called on. It's never been raised as an issue. It was considered, I think, by many as a throwaway line. I saw it as something to consider to convince my audience, and it's never really come up. As I indicated, I don't think that you can use natural law as a basis for constitutional adjudication, except to the extent that it is the background of in our Declaration. It is a part of the history and tradition of our country, and it's certainly something that informed some of the early litigation, I guess, with respect to the 14th Amendment, but it's certainly something that has informed our Constitution, but I don't think that it has an appropriate role directly in constitutional adjudication.
Well, do you disagree with the article now?
I do disagree with the article, and I did not endorse it before.
But let me just ask you the question. Have you made up your mind, Judge Thomas, on how you will vote when abortion issues are before the court as a justice on the court?
Senator, there is a lesson that I think we all learn when we become judges. And I think it happens to you after you've had your first case, that you walk in sometimes, even after you've read the briefs, and you think you might have an answer. And you go to oral argument, and after oral arguments, you think you might have an answer.
That's right.
And after you sit down and you attempt to write the opinion, you thought you had an answer, and you change your mind. I think it's inappropriate for any judge who's worth his or her salt to prejudge any issue, or to sit on a case in which he or she has such strong views that he or she cannot be impartial. And to think that as a judge, that you are infallible, I think totally undermines the process. You have to sit, you have to listen, you have to hear the arguments, you have to allow the adversarial process to think, you have to be open, and you have to be willing to work through the problem. I don't sit on any issues, on any cases that I have prejudged. I think that it would totally undermine and compromise my capacity as a judge.
The hearings continue tomorrow with at least a dozen senators waiting to ask their first round of questions.
Now some analysis of Clarence Thomas's first day before the Senate Judiciary Committee. It comes from Dan Rodriguez, professor of public and administrative law at the University of California at Berkeley, and Elaine Jones, the deputy director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Washington. From your perspective, Ms. Jones, as an opponent of this nomination, how did Clarence Thomas do today?
I sat and listened to Clarence Thomas today, and after having listened to him, I heard him retreat from positions he had taken, statements he had made. The 5 years prior to Clarence Thomas going to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, I mean, Clarence Thomas would give these passionate, clear statements of his views on very important issues, such as the role of the Congress. He would write articles and sign reports having to do with the due process rights of the family, what they are. And he would write about the Voting Rights Act amendment. And in certain instances, his remarks were almost strident, and I would say somewhat intemperate. Today, rather than hearing an explanation and a defense of these positions, I heard, oh, I don't remember the context of that, Senator X, or Senator X, that really wasn't my view, or Senator X, I've changed my mind now about the Lewis Lerman article. So what I heard today, this strains credibility.
Is that good news or bad news?
Well, I take no pride in opposing the Clarence Thomas nomination. I mean, I would like to see an African American on the Supreme Court, and I think that is what we hear from the black community, and I am part of that community. We would like to see an African American. However, this is not the African American, because when you read his record speaks for itself, and based on that record, we have to oppose.
So what he said today, if he in fact, your reading of it is that he retreated from some positions.
Yes.
You think, in other words, are you suggesting that he said what he thought he had to say to get confirmed, or do you think he's legitimately retreated over to the good ground where you are?
What I know now that he is trying to get confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States before Congress, and this is a post-nomination, these are post-nomination statements. I think that we should look very, very closely at the record which caused him to get this nomination, which are many of those statements and articles and writings.
Mr. Rodriguez, from your perspective as a supporter of the Clarence Thomas nomination, did you smell and see and hear the same retreat from his past positions that Elaine Jones did?
Well, no. Judge Thomas was asked some direct questions about some statements he had made in the past. The statement about Lehrman's views on abortion and various other statements. I think he did pretty well. I think that Judge Thomas was a bit ill at ease, in particular in the context of what I regarded as the most important event, and certainly the most interesting of today's process, which was the colloquy with Senator Biden. In particular...
On natural law.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. In general, on the basis of the senator's statements, I think the interest groups opposed to Clarence Thomas were very successful in one important respect, that is in defining the agenda for the hearings. The agenda for the hearings is not, contrary to Senator Danforth's statements, Judge Thomas's statements himself, about Judge Thomas the man. Rather, the confirmation procedures are going to be about Judge Thomas's views on natural law, and in particular the various strands of natural law, which are very interesting.
Well, but let me pick up on this point that Elaine Jones made. I assume that you, as Elaine Jones, as has Elaine Jones, have read up on Clarence Thomas's record, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And you're a conservative, and you have read it from your perspective. And did you hear anything today that made you kind of leap from your chair, figuratively or otherwise, say, hey, wait a minute, that's not what he said. That's not what I read he said in 1987. Anything like that that stunned you, that he seemed to be backing off of?
No, not at all. There was something that concerned me as an American concerned with the confirmation process and with the prospect of Judge Thomas becoming Justice Thomas. And once again, I refer to the colloquy with Senator Biden. In pressing the point, I think very interestingly, Senator Biden tried to zero Judge Thomas in on this whole debate, not only about natural law, but about economic rights, economic liberties, what these conceptions of economic liberties and Judge Thomas's statements about them have to say about his constitutional philosophy. And one of the things that concerned me is that Judge Thomas seemed to be in the posture of somebody explaining away those statements, saying something simply, well, those were the statements of a part-time political philosopher, not a judge, and I am a judge. I am certainly anxious to hear a lot more from Judge Thomas about affirmatively what he thinks about the relationship between what is clearly, at least at some level, an endorsement of economic liberties and economic rights, and what that does have to say about his theory of constitutional adjudication, statutory interpretation, his approach to judging. What we heard today was frankly mostly responding to various statements he had made in the past, snippets of articles, speeches, and the like.
On this question of the approach that he would take to judging, beginning with you, Ms. Jones, he said in response to a question from Senator Hatch that he did not believe that judges should apply personal philosophies in adjudicating cases, and that he certainly would not do that. Do you, first of all, buy that as a general premise, and do you buy that as far as him personally?
Well, a couple of responses. One is, a judge brings the sum total of his and her experience to every case. I mean, of course, when you're interpreting a statute and or the Constitution, you have a brief the parties before you hear oral arguments from the parties. He's on the appellate court now, not on the trial court, but as a trial court judge, you have credibility findings to make and all kinds of issues that the court has to bring the court's own experience to bear in looking at an issue. And that experience, of course, has to be guided, and the framework has to be the statute and the Constitution that the court looks to. But Clarence Thomas has been talking about his experiences for the past, most of the day today, and we've been reading about his experiences over the course of the past 8 weeks. His impoverished background, the bootstraps that he found to pull himself up, and all of that. And while all of that is commendable, that does not tell us whether or not Clarence Thomas should sit as a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. We have to look at the man's record. We have to look at what the man has said and what the man has written. And one of the things that profoundly concerned me is this whole issue about the family. This White House group on the family. Clarence Thomas took the position because he signed onto the report, and he's a good lawyer, and so I assume he should read what he signs. Today he said he did not. Sign onto a report that indicated that the situation where a 63-year-old black woman was jailed because she violated a city ordinance where she lived with both of her grandsons in her own home. The grandsons were first cousins, and that was an ordinance against cousins living under the same roof. Now, the Supreme Court struck down that ordinance in 1977 as violating the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, as well the court should have. Clarence disagrees with the Supreme Court because he signed the White House Working Group, which criticized those Supreme Court decisions protecting the integrity of the family. Today he says he never read the report. And not only did he say he did not read it at the time, he comes before the committee and tells the committee today that although we've discussed that issue for the past 6 weeks, he still hadn't read the report.
Mr. Rodriguez, do you share Ms. Jones' concern?
About that issue, no.
About that issue?
He said something else also, importantly, and that is that he agreed with the Supreme Court's decision. Indeed, he turned it on himself and said, of course, if that particular ordinance had been upheld, it could have conceivably been applied if appropriate, to his own situation. So he did more than simply suggest that he hadn't read the...
Well, let me ask you the philosophy question, because it was asked in the context of abortion. Does it make sense to you, Mr. Rodriguez, that any person, Clarence Thomas in particular, but any person could be a judge and, let's say, be adamantly opposed to abortion personally, for whatever reason, religious reasons, philosophical reasons, whatever, and still vote as a judge to uphold a law that would legalize abortion?
I think it's not only conceivable, but I would suggest that it may have happened that way. Of course, I have no more insight than does anybody else about who on the current Supreme Court and in previous Supreme Courts thought were in favor, in their heart of hearts, of abortion or were against.
But in judging, say, Clarence Thomas, and he says he could conceivably do that, then we should take his word for that. Is that right?
I think we should, in context, and the context, of course, is his record, which we can and will examine in detail, and also his statements about constitutional philosophy and adjudicative philosophy, which will come out over the next few days. In that context, the fact that he may express a view, a policy view, against or in favor of abortion or any other controversial issue, doesn't tell us about his methodology in approaching the Constitution, which is what we all want to know, and certainly the Senate.
What's your reading of that?
I find it very interesting, though, that we look at Judge Thomas's record over the past 5 years, the record that in substantial part had a lot to do with his nomination to the Supreme Court. And that is those writings and those speeches and the way he's conducted himself as chair of the EEOC and with the Office of Civil Rights. And now we're saying that because he comes in and disavows and states different positions, such as the White House Working Group, he says, oh, well, now that was wrong. Yet he was a signatory on that report, and he indicated that he was a working part of the group. He says now in this sort of post-confirmation conversion that, well, I don't, they're really not my views. I really don't hold those beliefs. I think we have to look at that very carefully.
All right. We have to leave it there for now. We'll be talking to you all again later in the week. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Finally tonight, we return to our series of conversations on why communism failed. Today, Moscow was the host city of an international human rights conference. Contemplating such an event only a few years ago, our British Foreign Secretary said it would be like holding a whiskey distillers convention in Saudi Arabia. Trying to square human rights concerns with the old communist pursuit of a utopian society has long frustrated Western supporters of the ideology. We get one of those perspectives tonight. It comes from James Weinstein, the editor and publisher of In These Times, a socialist weekly published in Chicago. He's written several books on socialism in the United States. Mr. Weinstein has been active in left politics since he was a teenager and was a Communist Party member from 1948 until 1956. I talked with him this afternoon. Mr. Weinstein, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What is your explanation of why Soviet communism failed?
Well, it failed on many levels over many, many decades, but the reason that it collapsed, I believe, is that as a viable social system, it worked when the task in the Soviet Union was basic industrialization. And when a highly disciplined workforce that didn't have to think could be manipulated and used to build the basic infrastructure. And the Soviet Union, in its early years, developed very rapidly. So that worked, but then it reached the stage where further development required initiative, participation, communication, and this was a society that was totally devoid of what in the Soviet Union they call a civil society, which Americans take so much for granted that they don't even understand what that means. But in the Soviet Union, as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, it was illegal to own a typewriter unless you had permission. There were no personal computers. The first personal computers went in there, I think, in '87 or something like that. And you had a society in which there was absolutely no participation or initiative on the part of the population in general, which was totally unsuited for modern production. So that's what brought on the crisis, which I think would have happened a lot sooner if it hadn't been for the Cold War, but that's a separate discussion.
Mm-hmm. You mean that the internal contradictions the phrase they used to like to apply to us, would have become apparent earlier if there had not been the Cold War.
Yes, that they used the Cold War in much the way that it was used here, which was to create a foreign enemy that enabled them to discipline the population and to pacify them. The problems began to emerge. Well, you had Khrushchev in 1964, or 56 rather. And I think that at that time, had there not been a Cold War, you may very well have seen something like glasnost and perestroika develop, but that was cut short because of the Cold War tensions.
But of course we believe that they created the Cold War, or they created the need for a Cold War.
Well, it all depends how you define the Cold War. As I see it, the Cold War was started by Woodrow Wilson in 1917, 18, 19, and has continued in one form or another ever since.
You mean when Wilson agreed to the sending of some U.S. troops, along with the British and the Canadians and the French, to intervene against the Bolsheviks?
Right, to put down the revolution, and when he defined it as a danger to Western democracy.
We discussed that with Robert Conquest, the historian, the other evening, and he said that was a myth that had long since been exploded, that was a...
Well, that's a historical question that you could argue either way. There are historians who agree with me. And then the Cold War proper, after the Second World War, I think it's true that both sides had an interest in it. So that you can say that the Soviet Union was as much responsible for it as the United States.
So you do not then see containment, the policy often attributed to George Kennan, as a great success, but as something that contributed to the prolongation of communist rule in the Soviet Union?
In a word, yes.
Well, give us more than a word on that. What could the West have done instead of containing what was widely perceived as an expansionist communist state?
Well, I don't think
that threatened Western democracies.
I don't think that the Soviet Union was in any position to threaten anybody after World War II. They were in a position to take over or to hold on to the territories that they had occupied, and that was pretty much agreed to. I don't think that they certainly never represented a threat to the West. In my view, they never represented a threat to Western Europe. We've always felt, that is, in these times, that if the Soviet Union attempted to invade Western Europe, the troops would almost immediately have to turn around and defend themselves from the rear. So I don't see that was a real issue. And I don't see that it was particularly an issue in the Third World. The Soviet Union did support the revolutionary movements throughout the world, of course. And whether you see that as a threat or not depends on whether you think that the United States should have opposed all of those revolutionary movements, which it did during the period of the Cold War. I don't think it should, so therefore I don't think that was a threat. But that's another question, too, that you could discuss at great length.
As a socialist yourself, how do you see the difference between communism and socialism?
Well, communism is what communism has done. Communism, according to Karl Marx, of course, was sort of the ultimate utopian society where it would be a democracy. Everybody would do whatever they wanted to do, fish in the morning,
make a bit of steel in the afternoon. And,
right. But communism as it came to exist is a one-party state, what I call czarist socialism. It's really the imposition of a socialist party, that is a party that was part of the world socialist tradition, but that came to power in a country that had none of the prerequisites for socialism that socialists up to 1917 always believed were necessary. Karl Marx and all of the other socialists in the world believed it would come in the most highly developed industrial country after there was a long period of working class participation in politics, a high level of democracy, a very active civil society, and all the rest. Obviously, that didn't happen. It happened in a country with a vast illiterate population, a population that had never participated in politics or any other form of civil life, with a stifling bureaucracy under the Tsar, and essentially the Communist Party took it over in the name of the working class, and also took over all of the property and became a one-party state in which the party, because property was quote-unquote socialized, was the property of the party.
Well, you saw all that, but you yourself became a communist for a period, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And what was the appeal for you, and then what turned you off?
Well, first of all, believe it or not, I wasn't very old at the time, so that is an excuse. I did not believe a lot of what was said about the Soviet Union, and I believed it was much more democratic than in fact it was. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I grew up in the 30s, and particularly being Jewish, grew up being very anti-Nazi, and saw the Soviet Union and the communist parties in most countries as being the main force against fascism.
What do you think the death of Soviet communism, because it's still the state party in China and some other places, what do you think the death of Soviet communism is going to do to democratic socialism in the West? Is it going to enhance its prestige, or is it by association going to turn more people against it?
Well, I think initially it will do the latter. One of the problems is that the Soviet Union defined itself as socialist, called itself real existing socialism as a put-down to all the other people who said, we're socialists, but you're not.
And said what they were doing through all that period, decades of terror and repression, was building socialism.
And of course, the other side of the Cold War in this country, both the ideologues and those who had an interest in perpetuating the Cold War were more than happy to accept the Soviet self-definition. So that pretty much became the definition of socialism. I mean, there are some people who have thought of Sweden as socialist or whatever. And with that defeat, socialism, of course, is also experiencing a defeat. But one of the interesting things is, I mentioned this in one of the editorials that I wrote in the last couple of weeks. The Times Mirror did a poll in May, and they asked the Soviet people what they preferred: old-style communism, democratic socialism, capitalism as it's known in Sweden, or American or German-style capitalism. And in Russia, I think something like 46% said they wanted democratic socialism, and 23% said that they wanted Swedish-style capitalism, which is not that much different. When you got to the Ukraine, which had experienced socialism as second-class citizenship, the percentage for democratic socialism dropped way down, and the percentage for Swedish-style capitalism went way up. When you got to Lithuania, which was a colony of socialism, and socialism meant foreign domination, democratic socialism almost disappeared from the list, and Swedish-style capitalism became the largest number in the poll.
What about this country? Is the demise of Soviet communism, which called itself socialism, going to make socialism respectable in the United States?
It's hard to say, and I think it's almost irrelevant, because what's really important are the principles that people who consider themselves socialists espouse or believe in. Many of those are already a part of all of the Western capitalist countries, and less in the United States than in most. But if you look back over the history of socialism, things like even workmen's compensation, but certainly Social Security, unemployment insurance, national health care, even public education.
So-called welfare state.
Yes, are all parts of socialist principle and socialist ideals. So I think that many of the things that represent socialist principles will become much more popular in this country in coming years. I mean, I think it's not going to be very long before we see some form of national health care. Obviously, nobody is going to call it socialist, except the enemies of it. So it's almost irrelevant whether or not there is a movement that calls itself socialist, and I doubt very much that you will see a very popular movement of that kind in this country in the foreseeable future.
Well, Mr. Weinstein, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, the major stories of this Tuesday. The Senate Judiciary Committee began hearings on the Supreme Court nomination of Clarence Thomas. Thomas refused to answer specific questions regarding his views on abortion. Soviet President Gorbachev called for a worldwide demilitarization and an end to the persecution of political dissenters. And the United States showed a trade surplus in the second quarter of this year. It was the first time in 9 years there had been back-to-back quarterly surpluses. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Jim. That's the NewsHour tonight. Join us tomorrow night for more on the Thomas confirmation hearings and Clark Clifford's testimony before a congressional committee investigating the BCCI scandal. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour since 1983 because quality information and quality communication...
Nights at 6:30.